So publicly funded improvements such as transit stations, river revitalization, to cite a couple of local examples, can increase the value of adjacent property. Value capture is a means to realize a portion of that increase as public revenue. Today, we are really delighted to have an outstanding panel to discuss an innovative set of strategies for leveraging capital sufficient in scale to really have a population-level impact on reducing urban poverty. Moderating our panel today is our very own Professor Marlon Bornet. He is the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis here in the Price School. Marlon is an authority on urban economics, urban growth patterns, transportation, and regional science. Joining him is, I'm realizing they're not in order, but here, second in from my right, is Professor Robert Severo. He is the Friesen Chair of Urban Studies at UC Berkeley and the director of the University of California Transportation Center. This is a multi-campus research center devoted to advancing economic competitiveness, sustainability, and livability in the transportation sector. Also joining our panel in the middle here is Fred Silva, the Senior Policy Advisor at California Forward. Fred has spent over 50 years developing public policy in state and local government. He is an expert on enhanced infrastructure financing districts, a new tool that we have in California to create investments in communities where capital does not naturally flow. Finally, we're really delighted to be joined by economist Dr. Martin Smolka. He is the director of the Lincoln Land Institute's program on Latin America. He is an expert on land markets and land policy, on access to land by the urban poor, the structuring of property markets in Latin America, and property tax systems. As Dr. Smolka comes to the podium to open our conversation, I invite you to join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And it's too bad to talk about these topics after lunch. It gives you a kind of indigestion, doesn't it? But let me see if I can make it run. Well, Carpentier used to say that there are two mechanisms that move the world, sex and plusvalias. Plusvalia is how in Latin America you refer to surplus value, land surplus value. I guess both have something in common, that both are probably practiced more often than people would recognize. And both also have some share the fact of being very prudish in the sense that to talk about plusvalias, people always raise their eyebrows saying, well, are you some kind of a communist issue or whatever? People are very, very uncomfortable with the name of surplus value or plusvalia as being something to consider seriously in cities and how to finance cities. So what is value capture? Value capture refers to the recovery by the public of the land value increments, unearned income, or plusvalias as we call it in Latin America, generated by actions other than landowners' direct investments. The important thing to retain here about this whole discussion, because this is pretty basic for everything that we will be talking here, is that the increments resulting from landowners' efforts are rather the exception. They are not the rule. And this is normally people think other way around. This is nothing new. This is something that exists forever, has been in cities and infrastructure financing just since the Philippines ordinance of the 16th century, actually. And you could find all kinds of examples in history. Actually, Haussmann also was inspired by that. In New York City in 1788, there was an application of betterment contributions there and things like that. So there are a number of examples. So this is nothing new. We're not reinventing the wheel here. This is something that has been there for a long time. It's just a matter of how you recognize. And some of the advances that are some new ideas that have been thought about in a more systematic way that is being used now that I would like to talk about. So I'm not going to go into these details, but we all know that there are a number of public actions that generate a lot of land value increments, like the urban multiplier. When you simply change land from rural to urban, normally this is a general universal number of about 400% of valorization. The base is of course very low. Markups in land development is pretty high also. Value of building rights, we have all kinds of illustrations of how high they can get, and I'm going to come back to that later. And expectations on new developments, for instance, just to give an example, in Bogota, in Cali, just the announcement of this project in Ciudadela de CEPACs in about less than a year and a half. It's about 8 times as much the increase in value without a single drop of cement being invested there. This is just expectations. Well, none of these, these increments accruing to landowners resulting from their own efforts. And, I'm not going to go into that. It's going to take too much time, but it's pretty obvious. That these are very conservative numbers taken from general evidence that we have in Latin America in particular. And so this simply says that if you're a landowner of a 5,000 square meter plot of land would get $400,000 when you simply change the building FARs, for instance. This is simply gifts that you're doing on a daily basis with the power of the mouse, as a planner would have. Somebody here, you change the color, and that's it. Right? Value capture comes in many forms. There are many instruments, and I'm not going to discuss all of them. I'm going to focus in 1 or 2 special ones. But they come in the form that you could capture value through taxes, through regulatory means, through fees, through partnerships, and many others. Here is an example of a number of applications of value capture in different parts of Latin America. And I took just cases from different countries just to show how widespread these things are and the kind of examples that you can draw from there. For instance, betterment contributions considered to be something very hard to do, but Bogota has a public works being funded at the scale of $1 billion of works currently being done, funded entirely by betterment contributions. Cuenca has been applying this extensively. Linkages, well, there are all kinds of tools that have been used extensively in different countries, in different parts of Latin America. There is an interesting example that was mentioned here before in the Mexican case of a transfer of development rights. For instance, Porto Alegre has done in a very interesting way of doing all the expropriation for a big avenue, the perimetral, the third perimetral that crosses the whole city, where people were compensated with development rights instead of all the indemnization was used. It's like a currency that's a municipal issued currency that they use, and they use extensively that thing. So it was a very interesting story about how to use TDRs as a local currency. What I want to talk really about, it's about the sale of building rights. And this is an idea that has been, it's not new, but it has been in practice in São Paulo and in many other cities in Brazil, and in other parts actually with a different name, a different type of idea, the concept in other parts of Latin America now. In Uruguay, there is new legislation that has that provisions for that. In Argentina, in Ecuador just passed a law. Peru is about to pass a new law on that will contemplate this kind of tool. So I'm going to talk about the selling of building rights. And this is the idea. Originally, it was known as solo criado. This is created land. This is basically when you add stores to a building, and this is basically what you're doing. You're creating land. You're multiplying the land. This is where the whole idea came from, and it actually came from a tool used in Italy in the 70s. Then the French used it extensively, calling it plafond légal de densité, and since 1976, it has been this discussion has been going on in Brazil, and actually since the late 80s, it was well in place now. There is this is in the Brazilian Constitution, this is in the so-called city statute. This is a very progressive law that Brazil has passed in 2001 that contemplates many of these tools. And I'm running a little bit because I know that you're going to be showing your papers there. Well, what is the idea? Basically, what you have here, and this is the, by the way, what I'm talking is, it's for those who want some more information about that, there is a policy focus report that we issued some time ago, 3 years ago at Lincoln Institute that explains that. Actually, this is in the cover of it. And this is in Curitiba. This is a building where the developer, because he had to pay for the additional floors that he wanted to build, he actually marked that thing in his own building. So this is the basic FAR that he could use without any payments to the city. This is the additional that he had to pay, and this is another one that simply used the maximum FAR. The idea of this charge on building rights is that the city establishes a basic FAR, or by zone, for instance, or by the city as a whole. And you have a basic FAR and then a maximum FAR. The basic one is that would come with your right as a property owner. The maximum is what the city thinks that the infrastructure can support. Okay, this is basically that is supported by the collectivity that you can actually build at a higher density. So in Curitiba, it has been used since the early 90s. Actually 89 where they started. In São Paulo, it's extensively used to the point that São Paulo reduced all the building rights in São Paulo. The FAR for the city as a whole, the basic FAR is 1 now. They did that in 8 years, changing it piecemeal. And this was done without major legal appeals on that. And this was extraordinary because this is, people always say, well, you can't reduce the FAR because you have acquired rights or whatever, because the city has at that area had a FAR of 2 or 3. Now you're saying that I only have 1. This is a taking. It wasn't a taking. And there is a huge discussion about where does acquired rights actually kicks in, right? And this is something we can discuss if you want. So nowadays, for instance, the city of São Paulo collects something like $100 or $150 million, depends on the exchange rate. It could be higher or lower a year. I know that this is petty money for Los Angeles or for most of you, but for São Paulo, it's money. Okay, it's money that matters. And there is a new instrument that is a derivative of this. Let me go back here and simply say that this OODC stands for Outorga Onerosa do Direito de Construir. This means that the onerous charge for the right of building. And this is the general concept. And CEPACs that I'm going to talk now is a derivative of that applied in specific areas. And what are CEPACs? CEPACs are certificates of additional development potential. It's a bond issued by the municipality, yet not implying a public debt. You have to be very clear about that. And it's sold electronically in auctions in the São Paulo stock market. So it's a bond that the city issues. Each certificate is worth 1 square meter of additional building rights. And you auction these, the city issues these tranches of the CEPACs and releases them periodically for a area that is referred to normally when you do a urban operation. This means, what is an urban operation? This is a polygon in the city, large-scale one, where you're redeveloping the whole area. You're putting a new infrastructure, with the new developments, you're changing, for instance, you could have been a old industrial area or something like that, or an area that has been abandoned in the city. Now you're going to redevelop with infrastructure and all that. And all the building rights that redevelopment would allow for, you would have to buy from the city in auctions done at the stock market. I have 2 minutes. So these are the, there has been two major urban operations. São Paulo has about 14, actually 16, that is being planned for the city. In two of them, the city collected $2.5 billion. I know that, again, this is petty money for you, but for the city of São Paulo, this is real money. And this is something that the developers paid with a smile on their face, because they knew that all the money that has been raised through the selling of CEPACs would have necessarily, by law, to be invested in the same redevelopment area. So they know that some of that will come back. So this is it's extremely successful. It's so successful that it made so much money that now they didn't know what to do with them. It was completely unanticipated, the amount of money that they would generate with these CEPACs, to the point that nowadays just the money that has been sitting in the market, in the capital market, has generated about $300 million in interest. That's a lot. Just the interest of the money that hasn't been used. So basically, this is the kind of situation you have. This area that has been redeveloped this is a new high-end area of São Paulo for business. They built this bridge that now the icon for the city, the $100 million. But there was a favela there, a slum. And this favela, there were 252 families. They were completely, this is the golden corner, as they call it, one of the most valued areas in the city. And there is buildings built for the previous slum owners, slum occupants, that in other words, they were redeveloped in the same place where they lived. And this is pretty unique from the point of view of producing inclusiveness without, in other words, redeveloping without displacement. Well, these are some of the auctions that you can see from the auction that the first auction, for instance, for the Águas Praiadas urban operation started with $172 for the square, for each CEPAC. It ended up over in 2012 to $600. So every auction, the value goes up. Well, a lot could be said about that. Just wrapping up, this is we're still very short of the potential of most of these instruments. Yeah, they're relevant, particularly if you compare the revenues that you're raising with these instruments with the total revenues of the city. It's not that much. But if you compare with the investment capacity that the municipality has, it's quite a bit. It's quite in addition for that. There has been success stories in many places. Most of them, what we learn about them is that when they try to simply emulate from other places, it doesn't work. When they try to do this on their own ways, this is where the most successful cases come about. But of course, there is a lot of resistance to that, and this is where the discussion becomes more interesting. That there is ideological, there are 4 I's as I refer to: ideology, interest, inertia, but most of it, ignorance. There is a lot of issues that people simply don't understand, they don't get it, that normally is the base of most of the resistance to these instruments. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for using a little bit of my time.
I thought what I would do is reflect a little bit on what Martin had said, but also talk about some other international experiences with value capture, but try to maybe contextualize it a little more in a California sense, and try to address the themes that we're raising at this gathering about inclusive communities and accessible, affordable housing. Just a couple of points. I mean, I'm an academic, so most of my knowledge here is having done research. But the research that I've done of looking at ways to finance public transport and housing using value capture principles, it's pretty clear there are some prerequisites. One is you have to have a lot of traffic congestion, so there really are benefits of living and shopping and working near transit. The market really puts a premium on good accessible locations served by transit. California clearly has that. We've got traffic congestion. But the other prerequisite is you've got to have a strong, buoyant real estate market in these kind of station areas where you can capture capture value. So yes, value capture works well in places like Pasadena, the Gold Line. It works well in places like Palo Alto, where they're planning to put an enhanced Caltrain station. It doesn't work in Richmond, California. We've tried to do this stuff. It doesn't work probably in Compton. So the very places where we need to create great, affordable, inclusive communities, it isn't necessarily the sort of cure-all. One of the dilemmas I face in value capture is it really has been framed largely from a revenue generation perspective. How do we get revenue from the value added from a public sector investment? It makes a lot of sense. But it really hasn't been framed very well in terms of how do we distribute that revenue to really create a better good. A lot of the money of revenue on rail systems in particularly go to retire the bonds and the debts and to enhance services of these radio rail networks that serve well-to-do suburbanites going to good-paying jobs in the downtown districts. Those aren't the kinds of communities where the poor folks have jobs. And they're not going to well-paying downtown jobs, and many of them are dependent on public transit buses going to scattered locations outside of the core city. So I think we have to be realistic if we're going to do value capture to create better rail systems, and these are radio rail systems largely serving professional class, white-collar office destinations. How do we begin to create employment centers? How do we create communities that are inclusive, that are mixed income, that are below market rate housing, that really allow the teachers and the public safety, fire folks and police officers to live and work and shop and be part of these communities. So, things like CEPAC, which is kind of a cap and trade. You set a floor area ratio maximum and you allow some kind of shifting and doing things like transfer development rights where you can allow folks to shift their floor area ratios so you can stack almost wedding cakes style these densities within a 5-minute walk shed of a transit station. Those are the great instruments that are there, and we've seen them work in many parts of the world. But what's absolutely essential is that there be the kind of incentive systems that encourage inclusionary housing, below market rate housing. So 15, 20% sort of things where you might be able to, for instance, stack up even higher densities, proportionally higher in return for these kind of mixed use, mixed income kinds of places. So I think that's the real challenge. Just a couple of other points. The city I have studied the most that does this very well is Hong Kong. Hong Kong gets about 45% of their revenue through air rights leases and land leases and station connection fees, interface fees. Not unlike Los Angeles when it first built its interurban red car system, where much of the income for building the rail system came from real estate. They're doing it basically now, 100 years later, when LA and San Francisco did this stuff a long time ago. The key thing there, of course, is that it's timing. They come in early before they've really kind of laid out the plans of where they're going to go, and they start assembling real estate at sort of pre-rail prices, and they get development rights, kind of 99-year development rights. But in many ways, that's the key. Once you've defined where you're going to put a station, the speculative market starts driving up these prices, and it's really hard to do value capture. So, their timing is critically. They sell the development rights at the with rail price, and the difference between pre-rail and after rail is huge. Huge profits that they're able to co-share with the private sector. But the key thing that they do here is Hong Kong has long had tall buildings above metro rail stations, but they've historically had lousy environments, terrible walking environments, not great architectural integration, not wonderful places to be. About 15 years ago, they formed a town planning division within the real estate office of the joint development value capture entity, and they started putting a lot of emphasis on placemaking, a lot of emphasis on public amenities, a lot of emphasis on services, and a lot of emphasis on kind of complete communities, inclusive kind of development patterns. And what they discovered is not only did they make better places, but they actually made better profit. That is, there was, I think, pretty compelling evidence that good urbanism, inclusive communities, not only helps generate revenue, and increase ridership, but these become more successful projects as a result. So we sort of have seen this literature and this kind of divided between the financiers that think about this purely from a revenue generation standpoint and the planners that think about sustainable green, transit-oriented developments and so forth. And I think there's enough evidence showing you can do both very well. You can create both sustainable finance and sustainable urbanism by better combining urban design and good planning with these kind of value capture approaches. So I'll stop with that.
What I want to do is to provide a practical example, a contemporary example about some policy choices that have been made by the state in order to deal with this question of investing in communities, neighborhoods, housing, and community infrastructure. And it starts back with the Economic Summit, which California Forward and the California Stewardship Network had sponsored over several years. We came in right about the time that the governor and the legislature were repealing the redevelopment statute. That, as you know, is a 40-year-old system for providing a variety of investments to meet community needs. And one of the pitfalls that it had was that it used somebody else's money in order to finance it. Basically, communities figured out how to use the school finance system in order to finance redevelopment, particularly housing. And it happened that there was a new sheriff in town, and he said, we're not going to do that anymore. So through this group of civic leaders, we had about 700 community leaders who thought, let's figure out a new model for community investment, knowing that the old redevelopment model, the current administration was not interested in fixing, if you will. So we came up with this idea that what we ought to do is to put a whole basket of powers together in a community public finance authority that could be intergovernmental, it could be multiple agencies who all had a particular objective in mind. So it can be either a single entity or multi-jurisdictions. And one of the things that's necessary in this is not to simply say, here's a basket of authorities, have a good time, but rather what is it that the community is trying to accomplish? And I want to use a couple of examples in that. One of them is the good city of Inglewood. Anybody around here from Inglewood? You know about Inglewood, oh good. You know what's going on in Inglewood, and I want to use it as a perfect example of an opportunity. So the community needs to decide what kind of community, if you will, it wants. And it does that through both general plans and its specific plans about its own economic development. It might use a different exercise of police power through development agreements, through form-based zoning, any other kind of opportunity you have to marry land use choices in the regulatory system and the financing system. So basically, it's a pretty simple process for forming a district. And I don't want this to look like, gee, this is just another special district that's formed. In fact, it is the formation of a public finance authority that's important. And it does most of the work. It decides what kinds of investments are going to be made and, more importantly, what kinds of activities it wants to undertake over time. And the reason I want to use Inglewood is it happens to have an amazing number of opportunities. It's got a light rail station going in. It's got undeveloped land in the downtown. It happens to have a new team in town, all right? Now it happens that that new team is bringing value, is bringing economic value, whether you like stadiums or not, for my example, doesn't matter. But they've got mixed use going in, so there's a lot of economic activity going on. And this is a point at which a community can take advantage of economic activity in order to make investments. So what are those financing authorities that are available? Well, what we did in this case was to try to capture all of the existing statutes, whether it's the Integrated Financing, Integrated Infrastructure Financing Act or other statutes, the P3 statute, and others, and bring them together so that the financing authority has property tax increment, it has fees and assessments, it can use assessments for benefit to capture value, it can use user fees, it can piggyback on state funding. There's a significant amount of energy money rolling around. There's cap and trade resources. So our primary objective was to have some core financing abilities. And I want to stress one in particular, and that is property tax increment. And those of you who follow this topic know well that we've gone through this period of having an odd sort of system, which was created in 1979, where suburban cities have a very small share of the property tax, but the big urbans have all of the bulk of the share of the property tax. A little funny thing happened in 2004, and that is the vehicle license fee that all of you paid had the rate reduced. And so the legislature came in and said, well, we're going to backfill that, and they backfilled it with a property tax. And they had the property tax grow by gross assessed value. So hold it. So the city of Inglewood, which is paying a lot of its AB8 money in order to pay off bonds from redevelopment, now it has a big piece of the property tax that grows with gross assessed value. Well, their current value is about $7 billion. That's their assessed value. Add $2 billion from a stadium, add another close to $1 billion in other improvements, and you've got close to $10 billion of value that occurs in that community within about a 3 to 4 year period. That increment, I would argue, that delta from the top can be used for community investment, it can be used for investment in neighborhoods, it can be used for a variety of purposes. So that's basically the long and the short of this basket of financing tools that are available. The Economic Summit is going to be in Sacramento in December 13th and 14th, and we're going to be talking about this and other issues, so we hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to each of the panelists. About a year ago, somebody asked me, after I had given a presentation, what about transportation policy in the United States keeps me up at night? So I had two answers. My first answer is I explained that I'm the father of 3 teenagers, and they're the ones who are keeping me up at night, really nothing about transportation policy. But my second answer is if I was staying up worrying about that, it would be our almost complete lack of land value capture and the fact that we had lost the nexus between our financing system and what we are doing with land and how we bring that back into public benefits. And this is much broader than transportation. And this is a very interesting panel because what we're pointing out is that a lot of our concern about benefits and public resources not flowing into communities of need can be traced in part to the fact that we don't have a financing instrument that builds a nexus between the value that's accruing into land and the way that we can fund programs. And I am so thankful to the Saul Price Center for convening this entire symposium and for really shining a very important light on this. Let me kind of just give almost a very short 1 or 2 sentence highlight of some of the key messages that I take from what our panel has presented. Starting with Martin Smolka's presentation, I am struck by how the land value capture ideas, and first of all, just kind of the basic idea that there are a host of things that governments do, from infrastructure investment to zoning to land use authority to creating development rights, that are creating private land value. And there's a very strong equity and fairness argument that would say that that is done by the people, for example, of California, on behalf of the people of California, and it's only fair that the people then reap some, not all, but some of that benefit. And we really lack mechanisms to do that. And Martin points out that what we regard as innovative here in the United States is quite common in other countries, in Latin America. And I think that's an important point. This is not a crazy, untried idea. We have many, many examples, although we typically do have to look outside of the United States. Robert Severo did a great job pointing out more examples and also bringing to bear a very interesting equity question. that you have to somehow think regionally and systematically to think about how these benefits would be regionalized to avoid the pitfall that the benefits might stay in the most robust real estate markets, which might be precisely the places that are, to a first approximation, doing okay right now. And so this is a very important kind of equity issue. And then Fred Silva has helped us become familiar with enhanced infrastructure financing districts, which are a new policy tool and, really quite possibly the best immediate way forward. And with all of this on the table, I'd like to start by posing to the panel the question of the equity benefits and bringing us back to that. What should we in California be thinking about if we are going to think about how to use land value capture to lift our most distressed communities? And I'd love for all of you to jump in. Martine?
Let me make a first comment, and that is that all the money that is raised from the selling of building rights, for instance, I'm using the case of São Paulo because it's just take one case, but it has been applied in other places as well. It's everywhere where they have that has to go to a fund that can only be used for social housing, for investment in infrastructure in areas that are lacking, or some other investments that are of social equity type base. So it's not, with the exception of CEPACs, it can only be by law applied, the money that you raise from these auctions of building rights in that area can only be used in that area itself. So you would always say, well, this is a gentrifying instrument, and this from the social point of view. Well, you could argue by, that in the past, most of these investments were done drawing on the public budget that now it's available for other users. So these are monies that in the past cities would do this redevelopment of areas, putting huge amount of monies that nowadays, at least using CEPACs, you can, okay, you take care of yourself, we could use this money for some other better purposes. So in most places where there is legislation on that, say in Colombia, in Brazil, in Uruguay, they all come under the heading of redistribution of costs and benefits of urbanization. This is under that basic principle is that most of these instruments are introduced. And the second point that I wanted to make here is that it is an issue where we have been focusing a lot on capturing some of the value that is associated with public urban investments. This is one component that betterment contribution or special assessment and their variations can take care of that. Even in some of the property taxes also increments that can be used. But we're talking here about something else that has been sort of out of the discussion, and that is the administrative acts that has enormous implications on changing values that normally people don't pay attention to that. And I was suggesting, for instance, when you rezone an area, the rezoning from residential to commercial can generate, I was using a very simple model, but a simple example that's very conservative, I tell you. If you own 5,000 square meters of land, you would be getting a check from the public agency of $1 million for simply act of changing that zoning ordinance there. And this is happening every day without people paying attention to that. So this is monies that could potentially be part of the budget that is being given away every day without even noticing it. This is the 2 points that I just wanted to have there. So it has a lot of course, of equity implications behind that.
Yeah. You know, on that point, one of the points I made earlier is that the existence of an updated general plan and specific plan so that the community understands what investments it's going to make in economic development will then bring more value. That added value then can be reinvested. Right. And it's one of the things that what we think is important in this public finance authority, that they focus on what investments they're going to make and then what will occur as those investments are being made in terms of a return on that capital to the community as a whole, whether it's investment in affordable housing. In the example I used in in Inglewood with respect to the amount of investment that's going on and how they can put that money into neighborhood improvements. So all that stuff kind of gets churning, which is partly why this was constructed the way it is. And I want to recognize the presence of one Mark Pisano, who is here from the Good Public Policy School. He's holding up his hand. He was instrumental in the creation of this concept. So I don't want him to not go unrecognized. Thank you, Mark.
Well, you know, I would certainly echo that point. I mean, one of the dilemmas you see in joint development broadly is it's very atomized, parcel by parcel, and it doesn't necessarily add up to kind of a good community, which creates value. You know, you get lack of good, sensible joint use or architectural integration or good circulation. So I think having a stationary plan to orchestrate a lot of parcel by parcel joint development value capture is critically important. You know, to me, the question Marlon raised, I think it's clear we can generate it, assuming we have the authorizing legislation, the mechanism and the will to do value capture. We can generate it given all the wealth and the pent-up demand for being in great locations in big cities in California. The question, though, becomes, again, how do we redistribute it from places like Palo Alto to Richmond or places like Palo Alto to ensure that we do have inclusive mixed-income communities? I would almost say it's a value capture form of tax-based sharing. I mean, that revenue added, there has to be some mechanism to ensure their fair share allocation either to multiple sort of station areas, maybe it's all part of the SB 375 Sustainable Community Platform, or that we mandate, as we historically have done in redevelopment districts, but outside of redevelopment districts, that there be some capacity to have inclusive mixed income housing. I mean, the bigger question, one other point, where we have seen the best examples of infilling and bringing in affordable housing and more inclusive communities are where they've done kind of infill adaptive reuse of parking lots. In many ways, park and ride lots on a lot of places, Pleasant Hill and BART, West Dublin BART Station, they become sort of a de facto form of land banking, that the land is just sitting there for parking cars until the market catches up and there's enough price pressures to infill with housing and to replace it with structured parking. But the economics tend to work. But again, it becomes a matter that these are houses and developments that are affordable to a mixed income of groups. My very sort of last point, that the biggest problem I see in America vis-a-vis places like Hong Kong or Tokyo, I could cite many other examples, is a legitimacy question. Public transport agencies that largely control the air rights and a lot of the land around stations don't see this as part of their role. It's really real estate development is that agenda. And the fundamental difference is you go to a place like Hong Kong is the philosophy of the transit organization is we're not just responding to markets, we're helping create markets, we're really creating a future development pattern which is very transit supportive. And by the way, that's going to fill up the trains and increase fare box revenue and allow us to do things like value capture. Partly why they're able to have that perspective is as an organization, they're not a pure public agency. They're a quasi-public kind of entity. They sell shares of the company on the Hong Kong stock market, so they have to be extremely entrepreneurial. But on the other hand, the majority ownership of the company is government, so they have to protect the public interest. So organizationally, they reflect the mixed good attributes of public transit. It provides private benefit, it provides public benefit. So that gives them the platform to be entrepreneurial, to do very proactive kind of value capture. So I would say a very important thing we need to do in America are those kinds of institutional reforms that allow transit agencies to be a bit more entrepreneurial, to really work with private real estate markets. And I don't see it, given our current organizational institutional structure in California. Transit agencies just don't seem to be willing and inclined to do these kind of deals.
Thank you, thank you. I know that the instructions early on were that at some point I should go to the Twitterverse for a question. But I'm not quite sure how I do that. Is there someone out there who raises their hand and says they have the Twitter question? Is there a Twitter question? Yes. All right.
So the question from Twitter is, we have heard how many of these tools can be utilized in areas that are trending upward, but how can this be applied in areas that are segregated or traditionally marginalized, where investment is not as prominent?
Okay.
I guess it's pretty obvious that by almost definition that value capture can only be used in areas that are appreciating as a result of something, of some public action, of some investment, something like that. If you have an area that is, values are decreasing, unless you're redeveloping the whole area and you're going to think about a package of investments to be done there to redefine or redevelop the whole area, then you can talk about that the differences in values that you're going to generate. Like in CEPACs, CEPACs is typically areas that used to be devalued, areas that were sort of being abandoned, or areas that which value is going down, and you're redefining the area in the city, re-equipping the area, rezoning the area, and all the new developments potential that the area is being generated through these investments are going to be funded by the increasing buildability that you're introducing to that area. The interesting thing about CEPACs, in the special for that, is that you actually get the money before you need to do the investment. So the more people believe that that area, that the investment is going to occur, the higher the value that the auction is going to capture on the CEPACs are going to capture in these auctions. And the less you believe that something's going to happen, the lower the value. So it's a very ingenious mechanism to fund and to generate a self-fund all the resources that you need for appreciating an area that is being rezoned in general. So all these cases that I was referring to, these are all areas that have been, the Aguas Praiadas was basically in an old industrial area, for instance. Agua Branca, for instance, the new one that is coming in now, it's in an old industrial area. It's completely abandoned, cut by a rail line there. It's one of these old industrial areas of the city. And it's going to be appreciated at millions, I'd say.
Let me give you a California example where you have an incorporated city that's healthy. There's an unincorporated urbanizing area at its fringe, but the county has control of it. The city doesn't. And the city and the county both jointly agree to set up a public finance authority to put improvements into that area to bring the economic value of that area up. Because you're using a piece of as I mentioned earlier, the property tax increment that the county has that's countywide, and you're using a piece that the city has that's citywide in order to put investments into that area. Now, it takes political will to do that, but it's quite possible to do it.
Let me ask a quick follow-on. Are we thinking too small? It still feels like this is kind of neighborhood by neighborhood, but it seems like, and we've mentioned this, we need to regionalize the value capture revenues. How do we really do this at a regional level?
Well, should I take on that?
Go for it.
Well, there is I guess the basic principle behind that, the kind that I'm referring to, has to do with the separation of building rights from land rights. So if you own land, how far would your rights on that land go? And basically, from this strictly constitutional point of view on property rights, you could say, well, as long as I can have buildability of one store, for instance, just to make it very simple, all my rights, all the bundle of rights that I have to access and that I have on that land has been assured. Everything else is understood by the Supreme Court in Brazil as a faculty that the public grants for the private in response to something that the public is doing. So this is basically something that is owned by the public that the private may acquire or not. It's not a tax because you don't have any obligation to pay. It's only if you want to use more building rights that you pay for that, and you have to acquire that from the public. So that's the basic principle that it be. So in Brazil, there is a movement now to do this nationally. How many municipalities are, because this is part of a public responsibility under the administrative law in Brazil. If you give away building rights without charging for it, you're committing an administrative crime. You can actually go to jail for that because you're giving away public patrimony. Am I being clear about that? Because this is understood as a public patrimony. Now, how do municipalities do in order to avoid having to do that? Well, they simply set the basic FAR at the maximum. You don't have anything to charge because the basic FAR is so high already that there is nothing to be charged there. So there is a movement now in Brazil in order to have nationally defined a FAR of 1 nationally, not only in certain cities. Once you do that, then the difference would always have to be part of a public. So this is one way of doing this nationally, if you want. But of course, there are many issues at metropolitan areas. If one jurisdiction charges for that and the other one doesn't, then there is some issues there.
Well, my simple response again would be that we should do it in the places with robust, healthy real estate economies and share some of that value added using regional sharing mechanisms, assuming we have the regional entities to do this, to channel some of those value added revenues in less privileged areas. But I'm not sure value capture is the right way to deal with distressed communities. I would submit, we've long tried to do kind of tax increment financing and to sort of underwrite some of the risks through all kinds of public-private partnerships, where we've generally seen the best examples are where, sort of like the Fruitvale BART station, where you get partnerships of foundations for philanthropy, HUD as part of this doing low-income housing tax credits, the Transit Authority donating some land. You sort of share the risk, but you sort of have a vision over a 20-year time period to create kind of a healthy, complete community. It's a ways to go still in places like this, but I think it's fundamentally a question of all the stakeholders and the philanthropists and foundation communities being part of the program to really empower these kinds of places. So I'm not convinced land value capture is the right mechanism. I think there's other ways to empower and create healthier transit-oriented places in these less privileged districts.
Fred? You want a chance at this question?
Well, no, I think we've covered it well. The issues we've been talking about are basically community-based, particularly where value capture is considered and you're using assessments for benefit because the infrastructure is benefiting that property and therefore its values rise. It's tough to take that and turn that into the regional scale, because at the regional scale, you're talking more about some form of a tax-based sharing. And I think it's hard to take that community impact, neighborhood impact, if you will, and to try to stretch that at the regional scale.
I would say this holds for almost any beneficiary form of finance. I mean, if it's special assessment fees or impact fees or whatever, there's always going to be regional maldistribution. So to what degree, if we use impact fees to generate revenues, to improve sidewalks and protected bikeways and better infrastructure, some of that probably should go to other less privileged communities that don't have the resources in the market to charge impact fees, but ensure they have some basic needs level of core infrastructure. So it seems like any fundamental beneficiary form of finance, there has to be some regional sharing mechanism. Ultimately, I think it comes down to state legislatures empowering localities and regions to form those entities to actually implement these very kinds of funding mechanisms.
Very, very good. Let me provide an opportunity for questions from the audience, either the live audience or the Twitter audience, as our organizers see
So we
fit.
can follow up with another question from Twitter while we're formulating
Certainly.
the audience. To try to combine two into one here, and that is, how can transit agencies broaden their mission to allow for value capture and redistribution, and how do we harness this for community change more broadly?
Okay.
Well, I'll give you one example. The Santa Clara County Transit Authority has the ability to use assessments for benefit to capture value. It uses it for its own purpose, obviously, but it has that power now. I don't know that there's any other transit authority that has it. BART does not.
I mean, to me, where I've seen the most success is when transit organizations create real estate development offices within the organization, and they're not there just to deal with eminent domain and condemnation. They're actually there to do deal making with the private sector. And if, WMATA has had this, BART to some degree, where they actually hire seasoned real estate professionals to work within the transit organization and give them the mandate to sort of, to the degree possible, buy some extra land when they're assembling land to plan stations, but more importantly, to sort of make particularly air rights deals or some kind of joint use kind of arrangement. So I think it's internal kind of reforms within transit organizations trying to really reward entrepreneurship and a bit more of a market orientation. But the point I made on Hong Kong, it's critically important that you just don't have people determining these built environments based on economic rates of return, that you're building great communities, that you're really creating the armature around the neighborhoods, complete mixed income communities, great placemaking, public amenities, all the things that make good transit-oriented communities. So good planning and urban design has to be part of that agenda, along with the financiers and the real estate development professionals within the transit organization.
If I
Yes.
could make a quick comment. I think when we talk about transit-oriented development or funding investments in transit systems, subways even, using value capture schemes, the opportunity to actually raise money from the area that will be benefited by these lines or these investments to other places is, I would say, it's minimal, because normally the money that you can collect from the appreciation of land in the areas that have been affected by these investments are not as high to even cover some of these these investments. This is typically, for instance, subway typically, they can raise some money. For instance, in Bogota now they're beginning with an interesting instrument of using a kind of CEPACs to raise monies from redevelopment of areas around the main the station of the subway that they're producing there, and they're doing with a kind of auctioning development rights from other parts of the city to these areas. And this is with an instrument that's inspired in the São Paulo CEPACs, for instance. But I would say that the chances of actually using this as a redistributive instrument at large is not as high.
Yeah, as it relates again to the theme of this gathering, to me, where we need to make a lot of progress also is the fact that it's clear, not only in California and the U.S., but very rapidly developing parts of the world, that bus rapid transit is going to be the platform that's affordable, that's going to serve some of these more marginalized or lower income communities. We don't have really good models of joint development or value capture around bus rapid transit corridors, and I would submit that's an area where we need to focus resources, these kind of joint partnerships of foundations and government agencies and transit authorities and others to really do some great TOD value capture models on bus-based corridors. We've got enough good examples on fancy, shiny rail networks, but it's those other kinds of places that are going to more serve the under-resourced communities. So.
Hi, Ving Nguyen with the Weingart Foundation. One of the projects that is being discussed in Los Angeles is, of course, the revitalization of the Los Angeles River. Is that something where value capture would apply, and if so, how?
The straight up answer is yes. The good work that the studio that Mark Pisano did actually looked at the LA River and much of that, and to figure out how economic development along the river and improvements to the river could bring more value, therefore more investment, more value. And much of that work is now in the hands of the city of Los Angeles. The city council initiated a proceeding to study the creation of an EIFD in order to facilitate that. I don't know where it is in the political firmament, but I know that there's a lot of activity going on. That's probably one of the better examples of communities thinking about a particular big issue they've got and the tools that are included in this statute and how it can be used to implement it. And there's Mark.
Yeah, we have focused purely on rail transit in our discussions, but there's a vast literature showing that amenities and particularly water features add huge value capitalization benefits to 25, 30%, very much on the order of magnitudes that we've measured with the rail and transport systems. So yeah, don't get the perspective that you can only do this on rail bus lines. This happens on virtually any enhanced public corridors, and certainly the river, I think, would work well. But with that said, I don't know if Mark Bazan or others want to elaborate on what's happening on the LA River.
And Mark, are you raising your hand?
Yeah,
Fred said you did, just to point that out.
First of all, thank you for the question, and Fred, for your response. Just an observation about the LA River, and I'm also going to say the same thing about rail corridors and the same thing about busways. In this region, when we did our Compass growth plan, we based it on a return on investment calculation of what would happen with two things: the change in policy from zoning, and secondly, the change from investment from infrastructure or from environmental mitigation. And all three of those policies create value. And furthermore, our work showed that it created regional value in addition to value just to an immediate neighborhood. And the whole theory behind the legislation was in fact to do two things. How do you organize our society so that you in fact can capture the three values? And secondly, what funding instruments or financial instruments you need. And I will just say that communities in the Eco-Rapid Corridor, which is the most distressed corridor in this region, one small station at Compton generated a $500 million of value that could be captured. And the value along the LA River would be an order of magnitude greater than the amount of money that we're pursuing on our core grant program and could do it. So I would just conclude that one, value capture, not at a parcel level, but at a specific plan or a community level, has, as was stated by the panelists, an order of magnitude amount of resources that we're in fact not now capturing. The dilemma is we've never had the policy instrument anywhere. The closest that I've seen globally at a large scale is London that funded 1/3 of the world's largest, Western world's largest infrastructure project. 1/3 of it came from value capture. And it was done from the city as a whole. So it does point out, I just put those examples on the table in that we haven't had the institutional design. I think that's the key issue. It's not the knowledge, and it's not the planning ability, but we haven't had the institutional design to catch it. So thank you, Fred, for letting me, and Marlon for adding to the question.
You know, as Martine started off with all those acronyms and the nice words in Spanish and or Portuguese as we were kind of going on, I certainly felt jealous here in California, where at best we have one acronym that we might work with here, the EIFD, and yet we don't have a lot of examples of how people have yet applied it, right? And so, you know, this is again one of those tools that has huge potential. Billions of dollars are happening, and the point of the fact that the public sector gives these things away for free without consequence is critically important as we think about leveraging capital in underserved communities. And so I want to thank the panel again for bringing to us some knowledge that can speak to power about what could be done if we're thinking really creatively and innovatively as we go forward.